Hey guys, tonight we are tearing open a secret that television buried for 50 years. You know her. You have always known her. That voice, that particular soul-scraping combination of nasal indignation and barely concealed cruelty, the pursed lips, the stiff posture of a woman who has decided she is better than everyone in the room and is no longer willing to pretend otherwise. You watched her sweep into Walnut Grove like a cold front rolling in from the east, and you hated her, and you loved hating her, and somewhere in the back of your mind you assumed she was real. Harriet Oleson, the snobbish, gossiping, sharp-tongued proprietress of Oleson's Mercantile, the woman who made Charles Ingalls' jaw go tight just by opening her mouth, the mother who raised Nellie to be every bit as insufferable as she was, possibly more so. The character that generations of viewers have placed among the most memorable antagonists in the history of American television. But here is what nobody told you. Harriet Oleson never existed. Not in the books, not on the prairie, not in any census record, marriage certificate or frontier archive that historians have ever been able to locate. The name Harriet Oleson appears exactly 0 times in every single book Laura Ingalls Wilder ever published. She was not in On the Banks of Plum Creek. She was not in Little Town on the Prairie. She was not in the original Pioneer Girl manuscript that Laura wrote by hand in soft pencil on school tablets in 1930. She was not anywhere. She was invented, entirely from scratch, for television. 4. And the woman who invented her was so extraordinary at her craft that half of America forgot she was acting. But here is where this story becomes something far more complicated than a simple, the TV show got it wrong kind of tale. Because beneath the fictional Harriet Oleson, beneath the composite literary character that Laura Ingalls Wilder constructed for her books, beneath all of it, there were real women. 4 of them. Women who lived and worked and struggled and loved on the actual American frontier. Women who breathed real prairie air and attended real one-room schoolhouses and are buried in real cemeteries that still stand today in Oregon, South Dakota, Washington State, and Minnesota. Their names were Margaret, Nellie, Genevieve, and Estella. And tonight, for the first time in 50 years of television mythology, they're getting their story back. You need to understand something before we go any further. The story you're about to hear is not a simple one. It is not a clean, here is the real person behind the character kind of revelation. It is messier than that, more layered, more human. What actually happened on that Minnesota prairie in the 1870s, and in Iowa, and in the Dakota Territory through the 1880s, is a story built in 3 separate layers, each one laid carefully on top of the next, each one obscuring what came before it, until by the time you get to the television screen in 1974, the original truth is buried so deep that it would take generations of historians, genealogists and literary scholars with access to census records, handwritten manuscripts, and forgotten county archives to dig it back up. Layer 1 is history, the real women. 4 people who crossed paths with a young girl named Laura Ingalls during the 1870s and 1880s, who left an impression powerful enough that she still remembered them 50 years later when she finally sat down to write. Layer 2 is literature, what Laura Ingalls Wilder chose to do with those memories. How she merged 3 very different girls into one character, changed their family name, moved them across time and geography, and created the most recognizable antagonist in the history of American children's fiction. And why she made every single one of those choices. Layer 3 is television. How a producer named Michael Landon, a writer's room, and an actress of extraordinary theatrical power named Catherine McGregor took a character who barely existed in the source material and transformed her into an icon. How they invented a mother who had never appeared on a single page of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. And how that invented mother became so vivid, so specific, so achingly real on screen that audiences stopped questioning her and simply absorbed her as historical truth. Tonight, we're going down through all 3 layers, and what we find at the bottom will genuinely surprise you. Let us start at the actual beginning, not the television pilot, Not the first chapter of On the Banks of Plum Creek. The real beginning. Walnut Grove, Minnesota. 1874. The town is new, almost embarrassingly new. It was founded in that same year, incorporated just a few years later, and in 1874 it exists more as a hope than a finished fact. A collection of buildings along a rail line in Redwood County, surrounded by miles of flat prairie grass that the wind moves in long, slow waves, the way something breathing moves. The population in the 1880 census will reach 165 people. In 1874 it is considerably less. Into this small, ambitious, not yet fully realised town comes a family. The Ingalls, Charles and Carolyn and their girls, including 9-year-old Laura, who has large dark eyes and a habit of observing things and filing them away somewhere deep inside herself. In a room that will not open again for another 50 years. The Ingalls family rents. They are not prosperous. Charles Ingalls is a man of enormous warmth and relentless optimism, a fiddler and a dreamer who believes, with the conviction of someone who has never quite stopped believing it, that the next piece of land, the next harvest, the next fresh start will be the one that finally holds. He has moved his family across Wisconsin, Kansas, and back again, and he will move them many more times before he is done. But here, in the summer of 1874, they are in Walnut Grove near Plum Creek, and Laura is attending the one-room schoolhouse and watching everything around her with those careful cataloguing eyes. And in that schoolhouse, and behind the counter of the general store, she encounters a family called the Owens. William H. Owens is the mercantile owner. His wife is Margaret, born Margaret Gibson, sometime around 1836. Their daughter is Nellie. Their son is Willie. The Owens family owns the commercial heart of Walnut Grove's modest community. They are not wealthy in any grand sense, but they are established. They have a business. They have an address that stays fixed while other families drift. They are not renters moving between claims and harvests trying to find solid ground. In the quiet, unspoken class hierarchy of a frontier town in 1874, that distinction matters considerably. It matters to the children too, perhaps most of all to the children. Now, here is the first thing you need to hold in your mind, because it will matter later when we get to the television version and the contrast will be stark. We do not actually know what Margaret Owens was like. We know she existed. We know her maiden name was Gibson. We know she was born around 1836, probably in Pennsylvania or New York, and that she married William Owens, who would go on to become Walnut Grove's very first town treasurer in 1879 when the town was formally incorporated. We know she had 2 children. We know she died in 1908. We know the historical record, census forms, land documents, municipal records, confirms a woman who moved through the ordinary machinery of frontier life without generating the kind of drama that leaves documentary evidence behind. What we do not know is her personality, her warmth, her cruelty, her humour, her pettiness, her generosity. We do not have a single letter written by Margaret Owens. We do not have her diary. We do not have a neighbour's account of what she was like behind the counter on a busy Saturday morning, or how she spoke to customers who had run up their accounts too far, or whether she was the kind of woman who made people feel welcome when they walked through her door, or the kind who made them feel measured. The historical record about Margaret Owens, the actual human being, is almost completely silent. And into that silence, television poured an entire woman. A specific, breathing, fully realised woman with a signature laugh, a distinctive voice, a set of mannerisms that became instantly recognisable across the country, 9 seasons of storylines, and a catchphrase that still makes people smile 5 decades later. A woman created not by history, but by an actress from California who had never set foot on the Minnesota prairie. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That part comes much later. First, we need to meet the real daughter. Nellie Winfield Owens was born in 1868, likely in Illinois, before her family moved north to Minnesota. She grew up behind the counter of her father's store in Walnut Grove, surrounded by the particular social confidence that comes from being a merchant's child in a small town full of farmers and labourers and transient families who needed what your father sold. She and her brother Willie attended the same one-room schoolhouse as Laura Ingalls, and Laura, looking back 50 years later when she wrote her original autobiography, remembered Nellie and Willie as rude and selfish. 3 words. That is nearly the entirety of what Laura wrote about the real Nellie Owens in her original manuscript. Rude and selfish. Not a detailed portrait. Not an elaborate indictment. Just 3 words, who dropped into a handwritten memory like a stone into still water. But they were enough. They established that this girl, this merchant's daughter with her fixed address and her father's store, had made enough of an impression on young Laura Ingalls to still be sitting somewhere in her memory 5 decades on. And when Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down to build her books, she reached back into that memory and she used what she found there. Now, was Nellie Owens actually rude and selfish? Here is the honest answer. We genuinely do not know. What we have is Laura's memory of a childhood rivalry, filtered through 50 years of living and the inevitable distortions that time applies to everything we once felt strongly. What we have is the economic reality that the Owens family occupied a higher social rung than the Ingalls in Walnut Grove's tiny hierarchy. What we do not have is any statement from Nellie Owens herself. No letter, no interview, no record of how she remembered those years, or whether she remembered Laura at all. What we do know is what Nellie Owens did with the rest of her life. She grew up. She married and became Nellie Curie. She moved west to Oregon. She settled in Estacada, a quiet town southeast of Portland, and she lived there until she died in 1949 at 80 years old. She outlived her fictional counterpart by decades. She outlived the Little House books. She outlived the cultural mythology that Laura Ingalls Wilder built around those childhood years in Minnesota. She never once, in any surviving record, publicly commented on seeing herself in those pages. She lived a long, quiet life in the Oregon countryside, and when she died in the spring of 1949, the world's attention was pointed firmly elsewhere, and the real Nellie Owens slipped out of history as quietly as she'd entered it. She deserved more than that. They all did. But the story does not end with Nellie Owens, not even remotely close, because here is what most people, including most devoted Little House fans, do not know. The Nellie Oleson, who appears in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, is not Nellie Owens. Not entirely, not even mostly. She is a composite. A deliberate literary construction assembled from the memories of 3 entirely separate girls who lived in 3 separate places across a full decade of Laura's childhood. Laura took a name from one, a family background from another, a physical description from a third, an incident from a 4th moment in time entirely, layered them together like sediment, compressed them under the weight of narrative necessity, and produced a character so vividly convincing that for 90 years, readers have assumed she was simply one real person with a slightly changed name. The truth is considerably stranger than that, and considerably more interesting. One of those 3 girls was a young woman from New York named Genevieve Masters, who wore beautifully tailored clothes, spoke with a faint Eastern lilt, and regarded the frontier children around her with the quiet, unself-conscious superiority of someone who genuinely believed she had arrived from a more refined world. Her father was an educated man, a civil engineer, a surveyor, a superintendent of schools. Her family moved with a cultural confidence that was genuinely different from anything most Walnut Grove children had ever been close to. Laura noticed every detail about her. Another of those 3 girls was Estella Gilbert, who lived near Smet in Dakota Territory, who was exceptionally attractive by every account, and who made the considerable miscalculation of going on buggy rides with a young man named Almanzo Wilder, at the exact moment that Laura Ingalls had quietly, firmly, irrevocably decided that Almanzo Wilder was going to be her husband. That did not go well for Stella. We will meet both of them, Genevieve and Stella, in full, rich detail before this night is over. But first, consider this. One of the most remarkable things about the fictional Nellie Oleson is something that becomes obvious the moment you look at a map. Her story is geographically impossible. She appears in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. She reappears in Smet, Dakota Territory. She exists across multiple towns, spanning an entire decade. Always the same girl, always the same name, always the same recognizable family. But the real girls she was built from never shared the same geography. They lived in different places at different times, and they almost certainly never met each other. Nellie Owens was in Walnut Grove. Genevieve Masters was in Walnut Grove and Burr Oak, Iowa. Stella Gilbert was in De Smet. Laura took them apart and rebuilt them as a single person. That is not a mistake. That is not carelessness. That is an extraordinary act of literary engineering, and it worked so completely, so seamlessly, that it fooled everyone for nearly a century. Now here is the detail that should genuinely stop you cold for a moment. The mother, Harriet Oleson, the woman Catherine McGregor portrayed with such ferocious, comedic, larger-than-life specificity across more than 150 television episodes that she became one of the most recognised characters in American TV history. She does not appear anywhere in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, not as Harriet, not under any other name, not as a background figure, not as a single line of description. The parents of Nellie Oleson in the actual Little House books are present only as furniture, the mercantile owners, the people behind the counter, the ones who own the building. They are not developed, they are not characterised, they do not have storylines. Harriet Oleson was a pure invention. She was created by a television writer's room that needed a recurring adult antagonist for a family drama. She was assembled from nothing and then handed to an actress, a stage-trained woman from California who had spent decades working in theatre and was, by the time she was cast in 1974, on the verge of leaving acting altogether to work in an art gallery. Catherine McGregor took this blank space in the source material and she filled it. She filled it with 8 handwritten pages of personal history. 8 pages that she composed herself for a character who had never appeared in any book, creating an entire woman's past. Her upbringing, her family, her education, her psychology, the precise architecture of why she was the way she was. 8 pages. And then she walked onto a soundstage in California, and she made a woman who had never existed feel utterly, completely real. That is one of the most remarkable acts of creative invention in the history of American television. And it is a story that deserves to be told in full. So tonight we are telling all of it. We are beginning with the real women. We are going to walk through the documented lives of Margaret Owens, Nellie Owens, Genevieve Masters, and Estella Gilbert. We're going to find out what the historical record actually shows, and what it honestly does not show, and why that distinction matters more than you might expect. Then we're going to follow Laura Ingalls Wilder into the writing room. We're going to watch her open that original manuscript, the one she wrote in pencil on school tablets in 1930, the one she called Pioneer Girl. And we're going to understand why she made the choices she made, why she merged 3 separate girls into one, why she changed the family name, why she built an antagonist whose shadow would eventually stretch across a century. And then, finally, we're going to meet Catherine McGregor. We're going to understand where she came from, what she brought to that role, and how she took a blank page in the source material and wrote something so fully human on it that generations of viewers stopped asking whether it was real. 4 actual women. 1 literary construction. 1 television legend. This is how a character becomes a myth, and how 4 real human beings get quietly buried beneath her. Get comfortable. Turn down the lights if you want. Because what you are about to hear is one of the most complicated, most human, most quietly remarkable stories that American television has ever accidentally told the truth about, without realizing it was telling the truth at all. This is the story that got buried, and tonight we are bringing it back up. Here is what a general store in 1874 Walnut Grove, Minnesota actually smelled like. Walk through that door and the air hits you first. Dried tobacco and raw wool and something sweet underneath it. Molasses maybe, or dried fruit packed in burlap for the long journey from wherever it came from. There is the heavy, almost medicinal sharpness of camphor and turpentine. There is gunpowder and leather and the faint good smell of milled grain. Light comes through 2 small windows, falling across shelves stacked with things that families out here need the way they need water. Bolts of cotton fabric, glass bottles of medicine with hand-lettered labels, nails sold individually by the handful, because out here nobody buys more than they need right now. Coffee, salt, thread. And behind the counter, a ledger. That ledger is the most important object in the building, not the goods on the shelves, not the tools hanging from the ceiling rafters, not the glass case displaying the things people wanted to buy but usually could not afford. The ledger, because in a frontier community in 1874 almost nobody paid cash. They paid with promises. They paid with credit extended by the man behind the counter, or sometimes, just as often, by the woman beside him, against a future harvest, a future wage, a future run of luck that might or might not actually arrive. The general store was not simply a shop. It was a financial institution, a social hub, a post office for rumours, and the single most powerful economic entity in a town that had no bank. The family who ran it occupied a position unlike anything that exists in modern American life. They knew what every family in the county owed. They knew who was behind on their account and who was current. They knew whose husband had borrowed against a crop that failed. They knew whose children were hungry because their credit had run out. Power in a frontier town was not about how much land you owned. It was about who held the ledger, and in Walnut Grove in 1874 that ledger belonged to William H. Owens. William Henry Owens was born around 1835, most likely in Pennsylvania. By the mid-1870s he had made his way to Redwood County, Minnesota, along one of the great invisible currents of westward settlement that pulled ordinary men and their families toward what they hoped would be opportunity. He was, by every available account, a man who understood commerce, who understood the specific mathematics of frontier survival, the delicate art of extending enough credit to keep customers loyal without extending so much that you disappeared with them when the crops failed. He succeeded at this for a time, well enough to matter. By 1879, when Walnut Grove formalized its civic structures and required a town treasurer to manage its newly established municipal accounts, the community turned to William Owens. He became Walnut Grove's first official treasurer. That appointment tells you something concrete and verifiable about how the town perceived him. Treasurer is not an honorary position. It requires trust. It requires a demonstrated record of handling other people's money without taking any of it for yourself. And in a community of 165 people, where everyone's business was everyone else's business, and any hint of financial impropriety would have been news within a day, William Owens was the man they trusted with the public funds. He lived to be approximately 85 years old. He died in 1920, 12 years after his wife. That is everything the historical record reliably tells us about him, which is, in fact, considerably more than it tells us about Margaret. Margaret Owens, born Margaret Gibson, probably in the mid-1830s, in some combination of Pennsylvania or New York or possibly Quebec, depending on which census year and which record you consult, is one of the most historically present and simultaneously most historically invisible people in this entire story. Present, because she was there. She is documented. Census records confirm her existence, her marriage, her children. Her husband's civic prominence places her by extension at the centre of Walnut Grove's community life. She ran a household. She raised 2 children. She almost certainly worked in that store, standing behind that ledger with a knowledge of her neighbours' financial circumstances that most people in town would never have been comfortable acknowledging. Invisible, because not a single document tells us what she was actually like. No letters, no diary, no newspaper account that includes her name in any context beyond her husband's office. No church record that captures her saying anything. No neighbour's memoir that describes what happened when Margaret Owens looked up from that counter and met your eyes. Not a single word, written by any hand other than a child's faded memory about who this woman was when she was alone with her own thoughts. And here is what that silence actually means. It does not mean she was forgettable. It does not mean she was unremarkable. It means she was a woman in 1874, in a frontier town in Minnesota, where women's inner lives, opinions, and personalities were not considered worth committing to paper unless those women were famous, or scandalous, or both. The historical record is full of women like Margaret Owens, women who built communities from the inside out, who managed the invisible domestic and commercial labour that kept frontier towns functioning, who disappeared completely into the massive, indifferent silence of documented history the moment they stopped being useful to a man's official narrative. Yeah, the absence of evidence about Margaret Owens is not a mystery. It is a pattern. It is the same pattern that erases the names of the women who kept the books, hauled the water, mended the clothes, and sat with their neighbours through childbirth and fever and grief. The same pattern that made a child's faded memory of a merchant's wife the only portrait we have of a woman who lived 72 years on this earth. We simply do not know what she was like. Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who claims she was definitely kind, or definitely difficult, or definitely the opposite of the character a television actress invented for entertainment, is filling a blank page with their own wishes. The historical record does not support it in either direction. What the historical record does support is this: she existed. She mattered to her community, and she was never given a chance to tell her own story. That fact belongs to her, and it belongs to history. Her son Willie is worth pausing on, because he is almost always mentioned as an afterthought, and her son Willie, as though he were a footnote in his sister's footnote in someone else's story. William Willie Owens was born in 1869, a year after his sister Nellie. He grew up in the same store, behind the same counter in the same community. He's documented in the same census records, and he died in 1934. That is, essentially, the complete written record of Willie Owens's life. Laura, in her original manuscript, described both Nellie and Willie together, rude and selfish, without distinguishing between them, and then history, with its usual efficiency, reduced him to the brother of the girl who became a character in a book. He spent 65 years living a full, unrecorded life, and the only reason most people have ever heard his name is that he was born into the same household as the right person at the right time. The unfairness of that is almost poetic in its completeness. Now, here is where the story of this family becomes genuinely complicated, and where you need to understand something about the world they were living in, because it changes everything about how you see what happened next. The year the Ingalls family arrived in Walnut Grove was 1874, and 1874 was also the year the sky turned dark over Minnesota. Not metaphorically, literally. The Rocky Mountain locust, Melanoplus spretus, a species now extinct, descended on the Great Plains in waves so vast that contemporary accounts describe the sun going dim. They came in masses estimated at trillions of individual insects, and they ate everything. They ate crops, obviously, but they also ate wooden tool handles. They ate the leather straps on harnesses. They ate clothing off fence posts. They stripped fields completely bare, sometimes within hours of landing. The sound of them was described by survivors as a constant grinding roar. The grasshopper plagues hit Minnesota in waves between 1874 and 1877, and they did something to the social hierarchy of Walnut Grove that nobody wants to talk about, because it disrupts the simple moral story that books and television later told so cleanly. They made everyone equal in their suffering. The farmers, families like the Ingalls, already on the thin edge of economic survival, lost their crops. That part is well documented and well understood. Charles Ingalls worked on railroad crews in Iowa, just to put food on the table for his family. Laura's books do not flinch from describing that particular desperation. But what the books do not dwell on is what happened to the ledger. When the crops failed, the accounts receivable in William Owens's store became worthless. All that credit extended in good faith, all those promises of repayment backed by harvest that turned to dust and stripped stalks, evaporated. The farmers could not pay, and the mercantile owners who had extended that credit found themselves holding a book full of numbers that no longer corresponded to any real money. The grasshopper plague did not only destroy the farmers, it shook the merchants too. By the 1880 census, the Owens family's documented economic footprint in Walnut Grove was diminishing. The family that had been the commercial centre of the community in 1874 did not emerge from the plague years unchanged. The ledger that had been their power had also been their vulnerability. That is the cruel, ironic arithmetic of a credit economy. You can only be owed what exists, and when nothing exists, your position at the top of the hierarchy becomes a very short fall. The Owens family eventually left Walnut Grove. Margaret died in 1908. William followed in 1920. They moved west toward Oregon, along the same migratory current that pulled so many failed and semi-failed frontier families toward the Pacific coast in those years. They did not depart in triumph. They departed the way most frontier families departed, quietly, practically, loading what remained onto a wagon and pointing it toward the next horizon. And now we come to something that nobody talks about enough, because it is uncomfortable, and because it complicates the simple story of a mean family that a brave girl stood up against. Laura Ingalls. Wilder changed exactly 2 family names in the entirety of the Little House series. 2. In the whole span of those books that named real places, real towns, real neighbours, real events verified by census records, land claims, and newspaper archives, there were only 2 instances where she looked at a real family and changed their name to protect them from being identified. The first was the Owens family. She called them Oleson. The second was the Boucher family, a family of difficult employers who housed Laura during a teaching assignment, and whom she portrayed with considerable unflattering specificity. She called them Brewster. Both families were portrayed negatively. Neither family got their real name attached to the portrayal. Sit with that for a moment. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was scrupulously accurate about the names of the towns she lived in, the rivers she crossed, the distances she travelled, the crops that failed and the winters that nearly killed her. That same woman, who wrote with a journalist's eye for specific, verifiable detail, chose to protect exactly 2 families from identification. Both families were ones she had written about harshly. This tells you something important about Laura Ingalls Wilder. It tells you that she was not careless with real people's reputations. It tells you that she knew, with a writer's self-aware clarity, that she was portraying the Owens family in a light that might embarrass or hurt them. And it tells you that she cared enough about that possibility to alter their name before publishing. That is not the behaviour of a woman who believed with total conviction that every harsh thing she had written about these people was simply accurate and well-deserved. That is the behaviour of a woman with a conscience. It is also the behaviour of a woman who was, at the age of 63, writing childhood memories from 50 years prior and understood, even if she could not entirely resist those memories, that childhood perception and adult truth are not the same thing. She changed their name. She published the portrayal anyway, and the result was that the Owens family's real identity was protected from the books, only to be swallowed, 50 years later, by a television character who had even less to do with the truth than the books did. The irony is almost unbearable. Now, there is one more thing you need to understand before we leave Walnut Grove. One more thread that will pull tight later in the story, when we get to the part about who Laura Ingalls Wilder actually was as a writer and what she was doing with memory. In her original Pioneer Girl manuscript, Laura remembered 3 different girls who had made her childhood miserable. 3 separate girls, 3 different places, 3 different incidents scattered across a full decade of her life. She had not yet merged them. She had not yet decided to simplify. In 1930, writing longhand in soft pencil, they were still 3 separate people. Nellie Owens was one of them. But the one who left the deepest mark, the one whose presence in Laura's memories was most vivid, most specific, most detailed, most sensory, was not from Walnut Grove. She was from New York. She had blonde curly hair, beautifully tailored clothes, a faint Eastern lilt in her speech. A father who was educated, a civil engineer, a surveyor, a superintendent of schools, in a town full of farmers and labourers who had built their lives entirely with their hands. And she looked at the frontier children around her with the quiet, unself-conscious confidence of someone who had arrived from a world that was, in her genuine and completely unself-conscious opinion, better than this one. Her name was Genevieve Masters, and the story of what happened to her actual life from beginning to end, all of it, is the most complicated, most heartbreaking, most quietly devastating part of everything we're going to uncover tonight. Because Genevieve Masters died at 41 years old, 5 days before her 42nd birthday, of pneumonia in Chicago, far from the prairie that had followed her through her life, and she died in 1909, 23 years before the first Little House book was ever published. She never read a word of it. She never knew that her blonde curls, her fancy clothes, her Eastern accent, her air of easy superiority, everything that had made Laura Ingalls resent her as a child, had been taken and pressed like dried flowers into the pages of one of the most widely read series of children's books in American history. She never knew she had become a villain. But there is one more detail about Genevieve Masters that will stop you completely in your tracks. Something about where she is buried, and what that single fact tells you about how thoroughly a real life can be overwritten by fiction. Because the place where Genevieve Masters was laid to rest is not what you would expect, not even close. Smet, South Dakota. That is where Genevieve Masters is buried. Not in Hornby, New York, where she was born on November the 12th, 1867. Not in Corning, the cultured upstate New York City where she grew up and formed her first understanding of what the world was supposed to look like. Not in Chicago, the modern city where she died at 41 years old, 5 days before her 42nd birthday. But in Smet, South Dakota, the very frontier prairie she had once looked down on as a child. The same flat, wide, wind-scrubbed land she had once made clear, in word and manner, and the particular way she carried herself through a frontier schoolroom was beneath her. The earth that received Genevieve Masters' Renwick was the earth she had judged. You can spend a long time thinking about what that means, whether it is poetic justice or simply geography or something sadder than either of those words. A young woman dying far from where she started, far from where she grew up, far from anywhere she'd chosen, and finally coming to rest in a place she had once wanted nothing more than to escape. But before we can understand the grave, we have to understand the girl. And to understand the girl, we have to go back to New York, back to the world that made Genevieve Masters who she was, and who she appeared to be, before the frontier ever got to weigh in on the matter. Hornby, Steuben County, New York was a small township, nestled in the western finger of the state, the stretch of country that lies between the Finger Lakes and the Pennsylvania border, where the hills roll in long green waves, and the autumn light has a particular slant that makes the whole landscape look like it was deliberately composed. The Masters family did not stay in Hornby long. By the time Genevieve had any real memories worth keeping, the family had relocated to Corning, the same Steuben County, but an entirely different calibre of place. Corning in the 1870s was a functioning city, not large by Eastern Seaboard standards, but genuinely urban in the ways that mattered to a child being raised in it, with industries, with commerce, with a glass trade that was already beginning to define the city's identity as a place built on precision and craft. There were churches with real architecture, reading societies, lecture series, and the kind of layered civic life that accumulates only in places where people have been living long enough to disagree about things beyond mere survival. Schools in Corning ran full academic calendars. Teachers were trained and qualified. Students were expected to know things, not just get through the winter. This was Genevieve's measuring stick. This was the world she internalized as the normal version of how things worked, the baseline from which she would evaluate everything else she encountered for the rest of her life. And her father was not an ordinary Corning citizen. Samuel Oldfield Masters was a civil engineer, a surveyor, and had served as superintendent of schools for Steuben County. That final title carries more weight than a modern ear might give it. In the 1870s, a county superintendent of schools was the intellectual authority of an entire region's educational system. The man who evaluated teachers, set academic standards, and was trusted, officially and publicly, to understand what rigorous learning required. He was the man other professional men deferred to in educational matters. He was the man whose opinion about curriculum and standards was not merely offered but solicited. He walked into rooms and the rooms adjusted slightly to his presence, in the way that rooms adjust to people who carry genuine authority. Genevieve grew up in that house. She grew up knowing, at the cellular level, what competence looked like and what it entitled you to. Her sister Augusta Elgetha, whom the family called Gussie, born in 1859, would later become a teacher herself, eventually teaching in North Hero Township. The Masters family did not treat women's education as a nicety or an ornament. It treated it as the family currency, the thing every generation was supposed to increase and pass forward. You were educated not to display it, but to use it, and the using of it was simply the baseline expectation. A girl from the Masters family knew things. She was supposed to know things. The idea that knowing things might make her seem arrogant to people who knew less was not a consideration that anyone in that household had spent time worrying about. In 1878, Samuel Masters moved his family to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Genevieve was 11 years old. 11 is old enough to understand exactly what you have left behind. It is old enough to walk into a new classroom and take one slow, comprehensive look around and know, without being told, without needing anyone to draw you a map, that this place is operating according to entirely different rules than the place you came from. The school in Walnut Grove was a one-room schoolhouse that served students of all ages simultaneously. The academic calendar bent to the demands of planting and harvest. The children sitting around her had hands roughened by farm work that no child in Corning would have been expected to perform. Their dresses came from the same few bolts of calico available at the local general store. Their shoes showed the particular kind of wear that comes from necessity, not fashion. The gap between Genevieve's world and theirs was not a matter of individual moral failure on anyone's part. It was structural. It was real. It was the straightforward result of two different economic and educational environments, producing two different kinds of childhood. Genevieve had not manufactured this gap. She had simply arrived in it, wearing the tailored Eastern clothes her family had brought from Corning, with her distinctive curly blonde hair and the precise and clear voice of someone who had grown up around educated speech, a precision to the consonants, a fullness to the vowels that sounded to prairie ears like someone speaking from the far side of a wall that most people in Walnut Grove had never been near enough to touch. Laura Ingalls noticed every single detail from the very first day. She had been noticing people her entire life. It was one of the things she was best at. Here is the detail that makes the dynamic between these two girls considerably more layered than it appears on the surface. Samuel Masters did not simply move to Walnut Grove as a settler. He taught school there. The man whose family Genevieve's superiority was rooted in, the civil engineer, the county superintendent, the man whose very credentials were the foundation of her sense of where the Masters family stood in the world, that man was standing at the front of the classroom. He was the teacher. Which means that Laura Ingalls, who had complicated and intensifying feelings about his daughter, was also sitting in a room every morning being instructed by Genevieve's father. The intellectual authority that marked the Masters family as different was not an abstraction. It was standing there holding chalk, calling on students, assigning lessons, and giving Laura grades. Laura described Samuel Masters in Pioneer Girl with a specificity that has the quality of something stored at a depth where ordinary forgetting cannot reach. He was, she wrote, tall and thin, with bad teeth and a bad breath and small brown eyes and a bald head. That is not a description generated by indifference. You do not remember someone's bad teeth and bad breath 50 years later because the person left no impression on you. You remember those details because the impression was sharp enough to cut, and because the sharpness had something to do with the feeling, impossible to name cleanly at age 9 or 10, that this man's presence in front of your classroom represented something that you were simultaneously being taught by and being measured against. He was educating Laura while his daughter was, in Laura's perception, educating the entire school in the social hierarchy that Laura sat at the wrong end of. And There is another layer to the history between these two girls that most people don't know. The Ingalls and Masters families did not first encounter each other in Walnut Grove. In 1876 and 1877, the Ingalls family was living in Burr Oak, Iowa, one of the several moves Charles Ingalls made during the years the grasshopper plague had stripped Minnesota farmland and driven families in every direction looking for something that would hold. During that same period, the Masters family was also present in Burr Oak, Iowa, Researchers tracing the geographic movements of both families through census records and regional archives have confirmed the overlap. Two families migrating through the same difficult stretch of Midwest terrain, landing in the same small Iowa town at the same time. This means that when Genevieve appeared in the Walnut Grove schoolroom in 1878, she and Laura were not strangers meeting for the first time and discovering they had nothing in common. They already had history, the particular electric quality of a rivalry, which is different in its texture from ordinary friction, sharper and more personal and more self-conscious, may have been forming between them before either girl fully understood it was forming. By the time they sat in the same classroom with Samuel Masters at the board, they had already spent time in each other's orbit. They had already begun the process of deciding what to make of each other. Whatever conclusions they had reached them before Walnut Grove. In Pioneer Girl, the adult autobiography Laura wrote around 1930, the one she never softened for children, the one where she used her real voice and named real names and said what she actually remembered, she described Genevieve with a precision that reads like something that was never going to fade. Genevieve sneered at the other girls in school because they were Westerners. She thought herself much above us because she came from New York. She was much nicer dressed than we were and lisped a little when she talked. Read that slowly because every element of it is doing something. There is the sneering, the active, visible expression of contempt, not merely felt but performed, directed at a specific category of people, Westerners. As though the accident of westward geography were a deficiency a girl could reasonably hold against you. There is the explicit reasoning Genevieve apparently attached to her own superiority. New York, offered not as an incidental fact but as a credential, as evidence of something she possessed that the girls around her did not. There are the clothes, the constant, daily, inescapable, visible evidence of a different economic and cultural reality, impossible to ignore in a schoolroom where the gap between a well-tailored Eastern dress and a hand-sewn calico one was immediately apparent to every girl in the room, and then placed last in the sentence with the almost casual placement of something Laura knew she was choosing to mention, the lisp. The lisp deserves its own moment. In a list that includes sneering and explicit claims of social superiority and the hard material fact of better clothing, Laura chose to note a slight speech impediment, a small imperfection in the polished surface of Genevieve's self-presentation, a crack. You can read this two ways, and both readings are probably partly true. The first reading is that Laura was reporting faithfully. The lisp was a detail she observed along with everything else, and she was thorough. The second reading is that the lisp mattered to Laura for reasons that had less to do with accuracy and more to do with relief. The girl who looked down on the Westerners, whose clothes were nicer and whose father was more educated and whose city of origin was superior, that girl had something that was slightly, privately, unmistakably imperfect. The voice that carried all that cultural confidence was also the voice that lisped. Children who feel outmatched look for the cracks in the other person's armour, and Laura, sitting in a Walnut Grove schoolroom at age 9 or 10, had been feeling outmatched since the moment Genevieve walked through the door. She also wrote that she and Genevieve were keen rivals, both academically and socially. The academic part of this is worth pausing on, because it means that Laura Ingalls, daughter of a frontier labourer who moved the family every time circumstances demanded it, who grew up in a household where economic survival was a recurring concern, was holding her own intellectually against the daughter of a man who had been superintendent of schools for an entire New York county. And not just holding her own, competing at the level of keenness, taking it seriously, caring about it enough to remember it 50 years later. As a rivalry, that is its own kind of quiet extraordinary. Here is the question that will never have a full answer, because the only person who could provide it has been gone for over a century. Did Genevieve Masters actually sneer? Not in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense. Did she actually feel contempt for the frontier children around her? Or did she feel something else that looked like contempt from where Laura was standing? Because here is Genevieve's situation from the inside, to whatever extent we can reconstruct it. She was an 11-year-old girl who had left the only world she understood and been dropped into a place that was, by every standard she had been given to measure by, a diminishment of what she came from, her father, who had been a figure of genuine public authority in Steuben County, was now teaching a one-room schoolhouse in a town of 165 people. The family retained every internal mark of who they were, the education, the standards, the way they spoke and thought and ordered their household, but the external context had contracted sharply. The distance between who the master's family was and where they now found themselves was considerable and impossible to ignore. When a child finds herself in that gap, between the world she came from and the world she's been placed in, she typically resolves it in one of her two directions. She either adapts to the new environment, releases her grip on the old markers, allows herself to become someone who belongs to the new place, or she holds on tightly to everything that marked her as belonging somewhere better, Sosta somewhere more, and she makes sure the people around her know that she knows the difference. What Laura experienced as sneering may have been self-protection. What looked, from Laura's side, like arrogance may have been, from Genevieve's side, the particular defensive posture of a girl who had been stripped of her familiar context and was doing what people do when they feel exposed and vulnerable and out of place, asserting the identity that hadn't been taken yet, the dress, the voice, the city of origin, the careful maintenance of distinction, or it may have been genuine contempt. We cannot know. Genevieve left no diary, no letters, no personal account of anything. She has no voice in the historical record except the one Laura Ingalls assigned her, and that voice was filtered through 50 years of memory, and sharpened by the particular class consciousness of a child who knew every single day of her frontier childhood that her family was struggling in ways that the family behind the general store counter was not. What we can say, with certainty, is that Genevieve Masters had a perspective, that she had an interior life, that she experienced the frontier and Walnut Grove and Laura Ingalls from her own angle of vision, and that angle was never recorded. Genevieve eventually grew up and left the frontier, the way the children of frontier professionals often did, heading toward the kind of adult life that education and family background positioned them to reach. She married a man named William Graham V. Renwick, born in 1864. She became Genevieve Renwick. She made a life that does not generate the kind of historical drama that leaves behind a trail of documented records. Not poverty, not scandal, not the grinding, visible extremity that makes people findable across a century. A marriage, a household, the ordinary life of an educated woman in the late 19th century, moving through the world at the register that her upbringing had prepared her for. On January 20th, 1900, Genevieve Renwick gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret. Margaret Renwick would live until 1982, long enough to watch the Little House books become iconic American literature, long enough to see the television series air in 1974 and run for 9 seasons, long enough to know, if she chose to look, that the curly-haired blonde girl in the fancy dress sneering at the children who weren't as well dressed was a character drawn in part from the woman who had raised her. We don't know whether she made that connection. No one thought to ask her while she was alive to answer. Laura Ingalls Wilder composed what historians have come to call her Letter to Children Late in Her Life, a form letter she sent to the mountains of young readers who wrote, asking what had happened to the real people in her books. When it came to Nellie Oleson, she wrote this: Nellie Oleson moved back east and did not live many years. That sentence is partly true, and partly something more complicated. Genevieve did, in a sense, move back east, to Chicago, which sat east of Smet and east of every prairie town she had passed through. She did not live many years. 41 is not many years. These details align. But the sentence carries an implication that does not align with the actual record. Moved back east sounds like a return, like the girl who had always claimed a superior origin had finally in the end gone back to it. Like the prairie let her go, and she went home to the world she deserved. She didn't. When Genevieve Renwick died of pneumonia in Chicago on November 7th, 1909, with her daughter Margaret 9 years old and her husband William at 45, she was not returned to New York, where she was born. She was not buried in Illinois, where she died. She was buried in Smet, South Dakota, the frontier she had looked down on as a child, the town she had passed through on her way to becoming an adult, the flat, wind-raked Dakota prairie that she had once, in dress, in the quiet conviction of an 11-year-old girl from Corning, New York, made clear was not her world and not her standard. That is where she rests. There is no tidy emotional conclusion available for this fact. The practical reasons for the burial location, family connections, prior arrangements, the geography of grief, are probably less interesting than the fact itself. The girl who thought herself above the Westerners was carried back to the West, not east, not home, back. The Earth, as it turns out, was not paying attention to the social hierarchy of a Walnut Grove schoolroom. What Genevieve never had was the chance to answer. She died in 1909. Justice. The first Little House book, Little House in the Big Woods, was published in 1932. 23 years separated her death from the moment a composite fictional character, carrying her hair and her clothes, and her Eastern superiority entered American classrooms, living rooms, and children's imaginations nationwide. She never read a word of it. She never knew that the girl she had once attended school with had spent 50 years carrying the memory of her, turning it over and over, shaping it into something literary and lasting and nationally beloved. She could not correct it. She could not offer her own account. She could not say, "This is what I was actually feeling. This is what it was actually like to be me. This is what Laura Ingalls looked like from where I was standing." The only version of events that survived belonged entirely to one person. That is the tragedy underneath the drama. Not that Genevieve was portrayed unflatteringly, though she was. Not that she became, in the American imagination, the blueprint for a TV villain she never lived to see, though she did. The tragedy is that she had a whole interior life, a whole perspective, a whole version of those Walnut Grove years that was real and legitimate and completely unreachable. It went with her to that grave in Smet, along with everything else she'd never thought to write down. But Genevieve Masters was not the only real woman pressed into the shape of Nellie Oleson. And the third woman's story is a different kind entirely. Genevieve challenged Laura's social standing. She challenged Laura's sense of where she fit in the hierarchy of a small frontier school. She represented the particular sting of class difference made visible every day in a shared classroom. That was real, and it left a mark. But the third woman did not threaten Laura's social position or her academic standing or her place in a community. She threatened something Laura could not afford to lose. Her name was Estella Gilbert. And what she almost took from Laura Ingalls wasn't a ribbon or a school prize or a seat at the top of any hierarchy. It was a man. Specifically, the tall, quiet, Morgan horse-handling man who had already driven through blizzard conditions to bring wheat to a starving town. The man who, by the time Estella Gilbert appeared on the scene, Laura Ingalls had already quietly, completely, and irrevocably decided was going to be her husband. And for one season, one long, terrifying, carefully observed season of buggy rides and flirtation, and the particular social mathematics of a small Dakota Territory town, it was not at all clear that Laura was going to win. Before Stella Gilbert, Laura Ingalls was navigating social hierarchies. After Stella Gilbert, she was fighting for something she could not afford to lose. That is the difference between this rivalry and every other. Nellie Owens had challenged Laura's dignity. Genevieve Masters had challenged her pride, her sense of worth, her right to occupy the same room as someone who arrived from a better-funded world. Both of those rivalries had been painful in the way that most childhood wounds are painful, sharp, vivid, and gradually diminishing with distance and time. You survive them, you carry them, you eventually, if you are Laura Ingalls Wilder, transform them into a villain character who will be remembered by millions of Americans who have never once heard the real names of the women involved. But the rivalry with Stella Gilbert was different in kind. It was not about Laura's place in a hierarchy. It was not about class or clothes or who came from the better city. It was about Almanzo Wilder, and Almanzo Wilder was not replaceable. Let us start with the family, because the Gilbert family is one of the most interesting pieces of Smet history that most people have never heard of. Silliman Nathaniel Gilbert was born in 1833 in New Haven, Connecticut, the same city that gave the world Yale University. The same city that had been a centre of New England culture and education and industry since the colonial era. He was the kind of man who arrived on the frontier with more than most people. More capital, more credentialing, more accumulated family wealth from the kind of extended Connecticut Yankee lineage that had been building things in New England since before the country was a country. By the time the Gilbert family appeared in the Minnesota record, they were not struggling settlers. They were wealthy by frontier standards. Property records document that they owned thousands of dollars in real estate in Lake City, Minnesota. The stretch of Minnesota country where they lived became known locally as Gilbert Valley, a geographic tribute of the sort that does not get attached to ordinary families. Communities name land after people when those people are significant enough to define the area around them. The Gilberts were significant. Their presence was felt. Their names stuck to the land long after they left it. Silliman and his wife Emily had 8 children, born across more than 2 decades. Lafayette in 1859, David in 1862, Fred in 1867, Charles in 1871, Elizabeth in 1874, Ada in 1876, and Luella in 1881. It is a large family with the particular shape of large frontier families. Children spread widely in age, oldest ones already nearly grown by the time the youngest was born, everyone in the middle occupying the practical middle ground of helping raise who came after them, while still partially being raised themselves. On October 20th, 1879, Silliman Gilbert filed 2 land claims in a single day. A homestead claim northeast of Smet, recorded in the land office as N.W. 23-111-56, and a tree claim 6 miles southwest of town in Manchester Township, recorded as SSE 15-110-57. 2 claims, same day, both processed and filed in the deliberate, efficient manner of a man who understood land acquisition and how it worked, who was not stumbling into homesteading as an act of desperation, but approaching it as an investment by someone who had already managed significant property. Stella's claim sat north and east of the Ingalls homestead. They were not distant neighbours. They were, by frontier standards, close. Before we get to Stella and the ski rides and the particular drama of watching the person you love being charmed by someone else, there is another member of this family who deserves a moment. Because the Gilberts are not just the family of the girl who almost took Almanzo, they're also the family of a boy who became, in a small Dakota Territory winter, something that Laura Ingalls considered remarkable enough to put directly into her books under his own real name. David Gilbert was born in 1862, the second oldest of the siblings, 17 years old when his father filed those land claims in October of 1879. During the hard winter of 1880 to 1881, when Smet was snow-locked and cut off and slowly running out of food, David Gilbert made a dangerous solo mail run by horse-drawn sled between blizzards, pushing through conditions that most people would not have attempted, travelling to Lake Preston to retrieve incoming mail and deliver outgoing, covering a route that required both physical courage and the particular judgment of someone who knew how to read weather and terrain in a landscape that was actively trying to kill you. Laura put this act directly into The Long Winter. Published in 1940, she used David Gilbert's real name. Across nearly a decade of published books, Laura was meticulous about changing names when she portrayed real people. 2 families specifically, the Owens family and the Bushy family, had their names altered precisely because the portrayal was negative. Names of people she respected or admired tended to stay. She kept David Gilbert's name because what he did was heroic, and she wanted it recorded that way, under the name of the actual person who did it. The same family that would give her a romantic rival also gave her a neighbour, whose courage she considered worth preserving for the historical record. That is the Gilberts. Not a simple family, not a one-dimensional story, a wealthy Connecticut Yankee family who built something substantial in Minnesota, filed 2 land claims in the same ambitious day, raised a son who drove through blizzards on errands of community service, and raised a daughter who caused Laura Ingalls more anxiety than almost anyone she had ever met. Laura first encountered Stella at Sunday school. She visited the Gilbert homestead. She saw how the family operated, Stella and her father working the farm and caring for the younger sister Luella, while Emily Gilbert remained bedridden. Laura noted this detail in Pioneer Girl with the observational precision that characterised her memory of everything. Emily appeared healthy but did not get up. She had apparently been bedridden for years. Stella absorbed the domestic and agricultural responsibilities that, in another household, might have been distributed more evenly. She did the farm work. She managed the household. She helped with her youngest sibling. She was, by Laura's own account, capable and physically capable. A young woman who knew what frontier labour required and did it without making a production out of it. This is worth noting because it complicates the easy narrative that Stella was merely decorative. She was not. She was working land. She was managing a household that needed managing. She was doing what everyone around Smet was doing, holding her family's claim together through the particular combination of effort and stubbornness that homesteading required from everyone regardless of the wealth they'd arrived with. Now here is the detail that almost never gets mentioned. While Laura Ingalls was watching Stella Gilbert with the particular close attention of someone who sensed a threat, she was simultaneously, in Pioneer Girl's own accounting, nursing a considerable crush on Stella's brother. Fred Gilbert was born in 1867, making him almost exactly Laura's contemporary, a year or so her senior, the kind of age overlap that mattered in a small frontier community where the pool of age-appropriate young people was genuinely limited. Laura admitted in Pioneer Girl that she was quite smitten with Fred. Let that sit for a moment. Laura Ingalls, the same girl who was already developing the quiet, fixed, proprietary feeling about Almanzo Wilder that would eventually become her marriage, was, at the same time, smitten with Fred Gilbert, Stella's brother, the son of the family that would become the source of one of her sharpest romantic anxieties. The emotional landscape of Laura's early de Smet years was considerably more complicated than any of the published books suggested. She was not a girl who had eyes for one man only, moving serenely toward her destined marriage with clear-eyed certainty. She was a girl with feelings moving in multiple directions at once, the way feelings tend to when you're young enough that your heart hasn't yet learned to be economical about what it attaches to. Fred Gilbert eventually moved on. He did not become a significant chapter in Laura's life. Whatever she felt for him was absorbed into the larger story, the way many things were absorbed, filed, processed, and eventually left behind in favour of the narrative she was building. But it means that when Stella appeared as a rival, Laura was already emotionally entangled with this family in her own complicated way. The rivalry was not clean. It was not simply Laura on one side and Stella on the other. It was two young women with overlapping connections to the same family, orbiting the same small community, both in proximity to a man that one of them had decided, with the quiet conviction of someone who does not make such decisions lightly, was going to be hers. Almanzo Wilder in early 1880s, de Smet was a young man with land, livestock, and a specific way with animals that set him apart from most men his age in the territory. His Morgan horses were not incidental to his identity. They were central to it. The way a craftsman's tools are central to who a craftsman is. The way the thing you do best tells the watching world something fundamental about who you are. He knew horses. He managed them with the kind of authority that comes from genuine understanding rather than merely practiced handling. On the Dakota frontier in the early 1880s, a man with good horses was a man with mobility, with economic capacity, with the ability to work and to move and to operate at a scale that a man without good horses simply could not reach. It was not an abstract quality. It was practical, visible, daily evidence of a certain kind of competence. The Sunday buggy ride was the accepted, understood format for frontier courtship. Not too formal, not too private. A space between public accountability and personal intimacy, recognisable to any community for exactly what it was. When Almanzo Wilder began inviting Laura Ingalls for Sunday rides, everyone in de Smet who paid attention knew what those rides meant, including Laura, including anyone who knew Almanzo, and very shortly including Stella Gilbert. The specific incident that Laura recorded in Pioneer Girl involved Almanzo inviting both Laura and Stella on buggy rides together. The precise circumstances, whether he invited them simultaneously, whether he didn't quite understand what he was walking into, whether he was genuinely oblivious to the dynamic between the two young women seated in his buggy, is not fully documented. What is documented is that Stella flirted openly with Almanzo in Laura's presence. Openly, in front of her, with the apparent lack of self-consciousness about it that is either naivete or audacity, and in the case of a girl who came from a wealthy Connecticut family and who had grown up with the particular social confidence of someone who has never been in serious want of anything, was probably closer to audacity. Think about what that actually looks like, from Laura's position. You're sitting in a buggy on a Sunday afternoon, in Smet, Dakota Territory, in the early 1880s. The man beside you is the man you have already, in the private accounting of your own feelings, decided to marry. You have not said this out loud to anyone. It is the kind of decision that belongs entirely to you until the moment it doesn't, the kind of certainty that lives in the part of you that makes decisions before your conscious mind has formally caught up with them. And the young woman on the other side of him is laughing at something he said, tilting toward him, occupying his attention with the ease of someone who expects attention and knows how to hold it. There is a specific quality to the anger of watching someone flirt with the person you love while you are present. It is not clean anger. It has something in it that is worse than anger. The cold, unwanted knowledge that the rival may be doing something you're not doing. I may understand something about how to be charming and easy and openly appealing that you have not allowed yourself to practice, because you are the girl who is proud and careful and does not make herself available in the way that requires managing your dignity afterward. Laura was proud. She was always proud. Her pride was one of the things that defined her, the thing that had made her refuse a white dress at her own wedding, because she had already decided she would wear it for fieldwork afterward, and white does not survive fieldwork. That pride made her extraordinary. It also meant that she would not out-flirt Stella Gilbert. She would not lean into Almanzo's space, or laugh at everything he said, or perform the particular version of warm availability that Stella seemed to perform without effort. And what she would do, and did, was something completely different. Something much more like herself. Almanzo was a man built around horses, specifically Morgan horses, a breed known for its spirit and its intelligence and its sensitivity to the person handling it. A nervous rider communicates fear to a Morgan before either of them quite knows it has happened. The horse reads the hands on the reins, the posture in the seat, the quality of attention or inattention in the person responsible for directing it. You cannot pretend your way through competence with a horse that's smart. Either you're comfortable or you're not, and the horse knows before you do. Stella Gilbert was afraid of horses. Almanzo discovered this. It was, by the account of what happened afterward, a genuine disappointment to him. Not the small, manageable variety of disappointment that you absorb and set aside, but the particular disappointment that comes when something you were already unconsciously building a picture around turns out not to fit. For a man whose horses were not just transportation but vocation, not just tools but the primary medium through which he understood his own competence and worth, a woman who feared horses was a woman he could not entirely share his life with, not because he was inflexible, but because of the practical reality of what his life required. The farm, the equipment, the daily involvement with animals that was not optional in the agricultural economy of 1880s Dakota Territory. A woman who feared horses would be a woman at constant daily and practical disadvantage in a life where horses were everywhere and unavoidable. He may not have thought through all of this consciously, but he felt the shape of it, the way you feel the shape of things that matter before you have the language to explain why they matter. Laura told Almanzo she would not go on rides if Stella was present. This is not quite a demand. It is not quite an ultimatum. It is stated in the specific register of someone who is not asking for anything, who is simply declaring, with the flat certainty of someone who means it, what she will and will not accept. She was not placing her willingness to be seen with him in competition with Stella's availability. She was telling him what was true for her, and leaving him to decide what to do with that information. He chose Laura. The Sunday rides became 2 again. Stella Gilbert disappeared from that particular equation, and the competition, if it had ever truly registered to all parties as a competition, ended with the same quiet efficiency with which Laura had entered her objection. No scene, no declaration, no confrontation that anyone recorded. Just the simple, decisive resolution that comes when a man chooses, and the woman who is chosen says nothing more because nothing more needs to be said. That moment in a buggy in Smet, Dakota Territory, sometime in the early 1880s, is the moment these published books were eventually built around. Remove it, and you remove Laura's marriage. Remove Laura's marriage, and you remove the farm in Missouri. Remove the farm, and you remove the books. The entire edifice of the Little House series, all those beloved stories, all those decades of readers, all those shelves in schools and libraries and childhood bedrooms, traces back in part to a woman who was afraid of horses. Estella Gilbert grew up, moved on, lived a life that had nothing to do with Laura Ingalls Wilder, insofar as we can tell from what the historical record preserved of her. She married a man named Drury. His first name does not appear in any surviving record, and became Estella Drury. She was widowed. She raised her son Fred Drury alone, with a kind of quiet determination that the research literature describes as strength of a young widowed mother who not only cared for her son, but headed out west in true pioneer fashion. She remarried a man named Merrill, whose first name is similarly absent from the records, and became Estella Merrill. She moved to Yakima, Washington, in the central part of the state where the climate is dry and the land is wide, and the Cascade Mountains stand to the west, and the Columbia Plateau stretches east toward the desert. She lived in Yakima for 50 years, half a century in a single Washington community, which is its own kind of statement about a woman who grew up in a family that had moved from Connecticut to Minnesota to the Dakota Territory. She found her place. She stayed. The community she was part of, the life she built, the routines and relationships and local significance of a woman who had been somewhere for 50 years. None of this made it into the historical record in any detailed way. But 50 years is a long time. A woman who spends 50 years anywhere has touched 100 lives in ways that don't leave documents. She buried neighbours and celebrated their children's graduations and loaned things and borrowed things and voted and prayed and got old in the particular way that happens when you have been standing in the same soil long enough for roots to form. Estella Merrill became a Christian Scientist at some point in her adult life. We know this because it was her church that handled her funeral, a detail preserved in the Yakima newspaper death notice, one of the few surviving documents that speaks to who she was as a person, rather than merely as a name in a record. Religion has always been one of the things that tells you something about a person's interior life, about what they found useful and sustaining and true. Christian Science, with its emphasis on healing through faith, on the spiritual basis of physical health, on prayer as the primary medicine. That choice tells us something, though exactly what it tells us about Estella Merrill specifically is not something we can say with certainty. She died on September 16, 1944 in Yakima, Washington. She was 80 years old. Her son Fred Drury was living in Seattle. She had a grandchild. Her brothers, C.L. Gilbert in Union Gap, Washington, and C.N. Gilbert in San Pedro, California, were still alive. The family had scattered across the West Coast in the way that families do across several generations of westward movement, ending up distributed across the Pacific Slope in various cities with various last names, connected by blood and the shared memory of a family history that stretched back through Dakota Territory and Minnesota and all the way to New Haven, Connecticut. Here is the thing that will stay with you. These happy golden years, the final book in the Little House series, the one that covers Laura's courtship with Almanzo and contains the fictionalized version of the buggy ride incident, was published in 1943. Estella Merrill died in September of 1944. 1 year, 13 months separated the publication of the book that contained a fictionalized version of the girl who had once flirted with Almanzo Wilder in front of Laura Ingalls, and the death of the woman who had actually done it. Did she know? There is no documented evidence that Estella Merrill knew she was in the book. No surviving letter, no family account, no newspaper piece, no notation in any archive, suggesting that the old woman in Yakima ever looked at the new Little House book, the one that had been published while America was in the middle of World War II, the one that was out in the world for just over a year before she died, and recognised herself in the girl called Nellie Oleson, who appears in a buggy beside a young man named Almanzo Wilder. The names had been changed. Almanzo's name had not been changed. Laura kept it as she kept it throughout the series because he was her husband, and because changing it would have required changing the central love story of her own life. But Stella had become Nellie. The Gilberts had not been named at all. The connection was there, woven into the fabric of a children's book, near but visible only to someone who already knew the original story. Perhaps she read it and recognised nothing. Perhaps she never read it at all. Perhaps she did recognise something. A buggy, a man, a girl who was afraid of horses, and sat with that recognition privately, the way people sit with private knowledge when there is no longer anyone to tell. We cannot know. She took whatever she knew to her grave in Yakima, Washington, and the record does not speak for her. 3 women, Nellie Owens, who gave the composite character her name, her mercantile family, her brother Willie, the specific geography of Walnut Grove, and who lived to 80 years old in Oregon and died in 1949 as Nellie Curie, with no documented record of whether she ever knew or cared that she was Nellie Oleson. Genevieve Masters, who gave the composite character her physical appearance, her Eastern origins, her air of superiority, the particular way she occupied a frontier schoolroom as though she had descended into it from somewhere better, and who died at 41 in Chicago, buried into Smet, 23 years before the first book was ever published. Stella Gilbert, who gave the composite character the romantic rivalry, the buggy rides, the De Smet setting, the specific incident that shaped these happy golden years, and who died in Yakima at 80, 1 year after the book came out, perhaps knowing, perhaps not. 3 separate women, 3 different states, 3 different decades, 3 different life stories that had nothing in common except for the fact that each one of them, at some point, crossed the path of a girl named Laura Ingalls who was paying very close attention. Laura combined them into one character, changed the family name from Owens to Oleson, and published the result in books that would eventually sell tens of millions of copies in dozens of languages across more than 90 years of continuous print. The character she created, Nellie Oleson, became one of the most recognisable antagonists in American children's literature. Readers loved to despise her. Children wrote about her in school papers. Adults who had grown up with the book still remembered her decades later with the particular vivid clarity that well-written villains inspire. But Nellie Oleson, as readers knew her from the books, was already a fictional composite. She was not quite any of the 3 real women. She was something assembled from all of them, filtered through 50 years of memory and the specific requirements of children's literature in the 1930s and 1940s. And then, in 1974, something happened to her that none of the 3 real women could have anticipated, even if they had known they were in the book. She got a mother who never existed anywhere in Laura Ingalls Wilder's actual writing. Not in Pioneer Girl, not in any draft, not in any letter or note or spoken word that has been preserved. A mother who was invented from scratch, placed in the Oleson family by a television production team, and then inhabited with such specific, unforgettable, theatrical intensity by a single actress that within a few years, millions of Americans would have been willing to swear on a stack of Bibles that Harriet Oleson was as real as the prairie grass. She was not. But the woman who created her, who sat down alone with a blank page and wrote 8 pages of backstory for a character who didn't exist, giving her a childhood and a psychology and a set of mannerisms that would become among the most recognised in American television, that woman was completely, magnificently, undeniably real. Her name was Catherine McGregor. And what she built out of nothing is where this story goes next. The autumn of 1885 settled over De Smet the way all Dakota autumns did, with a particular kind of finality, the sense that whatever had not been finished by now would have to wait for a season that had not yet arrived. Laura Ingalls married Almanzo Wilder in late August of that year. The ceremony was small. There was no party, no dancing, for Laura removed the word obey from her vows because she had already decided she would be a partner, not a property, and Almanzo, who drove through blizzards for sport, apparently did not argue. Stella Gilbert, wherever she was that autumn, was not in the room. The rivalry was over. The buggy rides were finished. The question of which woman Almanzo would choose had been answered in the way all such questions are eventually answered, not with a dramatic declaration, but with the gradual accumulation of small choices that add up over enough mornings to a life. Laura Ingalls became Laura Wilder, and the three women who had sharpened her, who had been the grindstone against which she had learned the particular edge of her own identity, faded back into their separate lives in their separate towns, carrying no knowledge of the role they had been assigned in someone else's memory. What Laura did with those memories, what she chose to do, would not become clear for another 45 years. It is 1930. Laura Ingalls Wilder is 63 years old. The Great Depression is 3 months old. Banks are failing. Farmers who spent decades building something are watching it come apart in seasons. The country is entering the particular kind of despair that arrives not all at once but in increments, each morning a little worse than the one before, each piece of news arriving with the specific cruelty of a thing you already knew was coming. Laura sits at her desk in Mansfield, Missouri, and she decides to write her life story, not for children, not for the commercial market that will eventually transform her into one of the most beloved American writers of the 20th century. She writes it for adults, possibly for herself, possibly for the same reason that people in difficult times reach backward towards solid ground. Because 63 years of accumulated memory is a weight that needs somewhere to go, and putting it into words is at least the act of organising it into something that can be carried. She writes in soft pencil on lined school tablets. She titles it Pioneer Girl. By May 7th, 1930, she has nearly 74,000 words. She gives the manuscript to her daughter. Rose Wilder Lane is 44 years old, and she is one of the most widely read women writers in America. She has published novels. She has written for the Saturday Evening Post, for Harper's, for the publications that represented the highest tier of American literary life in the 1920s and 1930s. She has travelled the world, covered wars, interviewed heads of state, and built the kind of career that most writers spend entire professional lives working toward and never quite reach. She has a literary agent and a professional network, and the cultivated instincts of someone who understands not just how stories work, but why they work, what needs to be present, what needs to be cut, where the structure will hold and where it will fracture under the weight of what it's trying to carry. When Laura hands her Pioneer Girl, Rose reads it with a professional writer's eye. The assessment is not encouraging. The manuscript is too raw, too adult, too honest about poverty and failure, and the specific grinding difficulty of a frontier life that had not, in practice, resembled the romance that Depression-era audiences were already beginning to attach to it. It contains public drunkenness and frank assessments of neighbours and rivals that a publisher's legal department would read with considerable alarm, and the kind of unvarnished candour that makes for vivid memoir and terrible commercial prospects. Publishers rejected it. But Rose, who understood narrative the way a carpenter understands wood, its grain, its load-bearing points, the precise location of its weaknesses, saw something in the raw material that was worth saving. She saw the bones of a children's series, multiple volumes told in the intimate first person, set against a vanishing frontier that an anxious, as economically devastated country was beginning to mythologize with considerable urgency. She told her mother, "Try again, differently for younger readers." Laura agreed, and in that agreement, made quietly between a mother and a daughter in Missouri sometime in the early 1930s, the fate of 3 real women from 3 different towns was sealed. The problem was structural. When Laura sat down to transform Pioneer Girl into a children's book series, she was working with a memory that contained 3 separate antagonists across 3 separate geographies. Nellie Owens had been in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, the mercantile owner's daughter, rude and selfish by Laura's accounting, embedded in the specific landscape of Plum Creek and a one-room schoolhouse in Redwood County. Genevieve Masters had been in Burr Oak, Iowa, and then Walnut Grove, and then to Smet, the eastern girl who sneered at Westerners, who arrived with her tailored clothes and her father, the county surveyor, and her particular brand of contempt that announced itself in the way she looked at a room and found it wanting. Stella Gilbert had been in Smet, Dakota Territory, the romantic rival, the beautiful girl in the buggy, the threat that had been real enough to make Laura's hands tighten around something she was not yet sure was hers. 3 women, 3 different towns, 3 separate decades of memory. A children's book series could not hold 3 separate antagonists without fracturing its own architecture. A child following Laura's story from one volume to the next needs continuity, a recognisable world, a consistent cast, a villain whose face they can identify before the chapter begins. 3 villains in 3 locations would have diluted the dramatic tension that a good antagonist generates. The slow accumulation of grievance, the satisfying pattern of conflict and escalation, the reader's investment in a specific recurring enemy. So Laura made a decision that was, from a purely literary standpoint, brilliant. She made one. The character she built was named Nellie Oleson. The first name she borrowed from Nellie Owens. The Walnut Grove girl, the mercantile owner's daughter. The setting she borrowed too. The Olsons would run a mercantile in Walnut Grove, precisely as the real Owens family had done. If you had been a neighbour of the Owens family in the 1870s, and you read the Plum Creek book in 1937, you would have known immediately who was meant. But the last name she changed. This is one of the most significant acts in the entire construction, and it is easy to pass over without understanding what it means. Laura Ingalls. Wilder changed names in only 2 instances across the complete Little House series. One was the Brewster family, who appear briefly in these happy golden years, and were portrayed negatively enough that Laura renamed them Bushy. The other was the Owens family. Both cases involved negative portrayals. Both times she changed the name. Writers who change names when they are being unkind are writers who know they are being unkind. The name change is an act of conscience, a recognition that what she was writing was not entirely fair to the people it depicted, that they deserved at least the partial protection of not seeing their actual surname attached to the fictional behaviour she was ascribing to them. She owed them something. The changed name was what she gave them. Owens became Oleson, and with that change, something that had been historical record became fiction. Something that had been 3 specific women became one. Something that had been a mercantile owner's wife in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, became the raw material for a character that would, in less than 40 years, be understood by millions of Americans as one of history's great villains. Now consider the physical architecture of the composite. Nellie Oleson in the books has blonde curly hair, extravagantly fancy clothes, and the Eastern girl's contempt for everything that lacks a particular combination of money and urban origin. None of that came from Nellie Owens. That came from Genevieve Masters. Genevieve was the one with the beautifully tailored clothes. She was the one who had arrived on whatever frontier she found herself inhabiting, carrying the aesthetic markers of a genuinely educated, genuinely prosperous New York family. The county surveyor father, the Steuben County upbringing, the cultural capital that announced itself in the cut of a dress and the set of a jaw. She was the one who lisped slightly when she talked, a detail so specific and so vivid that it could only have come from direct, unambiguous memory. She was the one who sneered, as Laura put it in the original Pioneer Girl manuscript, because she thought herself much above us. Because she came from New York. Laura placed Genevieve's appearance on Nellie Owens's name and planted the whole composite inside the mercantile that the real Owens family had operated. The result felt completely real, because it was assembled from details that were completely real, just not about the same person. Then she added the third layer, the de Smet sections of the series. Little town on the prairie, these happy golden years, required Nellie Oleson to reappear. She had been established in Walnut Grove. Now she needed to exist in Dakota Territory, which created a geographic impossibility if she was meant to represent the real Nellie Owens. The real Nellie Owens had no documented connection to Smet, but Stella Gilbert did. The romantic tension over Almanzo, the buggy rides, the fear of horses that had disappointed him, and over the specific jealousy of watching another girl sit next to the man you had not yet found a way to claim, all of it came from Stella. Laura transplanted it wholesale onto the character she had already assembled from the other two women's components. 3 women, 3 towns, 3 entirely separate lives. One Nellie Oleson. What was omitted from the construction is as important as what was included. Laura kept the antagonism, she kept the class tension and the social friction, and the specific memorable unpleasantness that each real woman had contributed to her memory. What she could not preserve, in a children's series with clear moral architecture and the commercial requirements of a Depression-era publisher, was the full complexity of those women as human beings. Nellie Owens outlived Laura herself. She moved to Oregon, lived to 80 years old, and died in 1949, having occupied a long, full adult life that contained everything a long, full adult life contains. None of that exists in the books. The fictional Nellie marries, moves back east, fades gracefully from the narrative. That arc was constructed for literary tidiness, not drawn from the real woman's trajectory. Genevieve Masters died in Chicago in November of 1909. 5 days before her 42nd birthday of pneumonia. She was dead for 23 years before the first Little House book was published. In later letters to children, Laura wrote that Nellie Oleson moved back east and did not live many years, a line that scholars have consistently identified as a reference to Genevieve, the only one of the 3 real women whose life matched that description. Whether Laura felt, writing those words, the weight of the woman behind them, the woman who had died at 41 and left a 9-year-old daughter and was buried far from New York in a South Dakota cemetery, no surviving record confirms. Stella Gilbert lived to 80, dying in Yakima, Washington in September of 1944. The book that contained the fictionalized version of her buggy ride with Almanzo, These Happy Golden Years, was published in 1943, 1 year before her death. Whether she knew she was in it, whether she read it or had it read to her, or had anyone in her community connect her name to the girl in the story is not documented anywhere. That not knowing is its own kind of story. And it is not over yet, because there is one more transformation still to come. Here is the detail that changes everything about what follows. In Laura Ingalls Wilder's actual books, in the complete text of the Little House series, from Little House in the Big Woods through These Happy Golden Years, there is a character called Mrs. Oleson. She appears in approximately 5 to 8 scenes across the entire series. She defends her daughter when disputes arise. She stands behind the mercantile counter. She registers, occasionally, the mild social snobbery consistent with a merchant's wife in a farming community. She's a background figure. She does not scheme across town with the energy of a small natural disaster. She does not manipulate community events, henpeck her husband into submission, or sweep through Walnut Grove with the theatrical force of someone who has mistaken a Minnesota prairie town for a stage built specifically to showcase her. She does not have a catchphrase. She does not have a fully excavated personality built from 8 pages of handwritten character biography. She barely has a first name. The woman that 50 years of American television viewers have understood as Harriet Oleson, the magnificent, infuriating, comedic villain who appeared in 152 episodes of a network drama and made an entire generation of American children write hate mail to an actress who was, by every account, one of the warmest people on that set. That woman does not exist in the books. She was invented for television. She was invented by a woman who had trained under Sanford Meisner and Stella Adler, who had spent 30 years in American theatre building the technical foundation for exactly this kind of creative act, who was 49 years old in 1974 and nearly done with acting, and about to step in front of a camera and create something that would outlast almost everything else she had ever done. Her name was Catherine McGregor. She was born Dorley Dean McGregor on January 12, 1925, in Glendale, California. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Drama from Northwestern University in 1947. She worked as an acting instructor for Arthur Murray Dance Studios in her early years. She appeared in small roles in film and television throughout the 1950s and 1960s, a longshoreman's mother in On the Waterfront, guest appearances in The Nurses, East Side/West Side, Mannix, Emergency, Ironside. By 1974, she had been a working actress for nearly 3 decades. She was, by her own account, on the verge of leaving the profession entirely and going to work in an art gallery. Before she filmed a single scene, before she spoke a single line of Harriet Oleson's dialogue, Catherine McGregor sat down and wrote 8 pages of notes. Where the character had come from, what her parents had been like, whether she had siblings. She decided no, an only child, which would explain the neediness and the attention-seeking. What kind of education she'd received, what she believed about herself that was true, and what she believed about herself that was the story she told to hold herself together. 8 pages for a character who had barely a scene in the source material. 8 pages that became the blueprint for 152 episodes and one of the most enduring cultural presences in the history of American television. Hold that image for a moment. Laura Ingalls. Wilder took 3 real women and compressed them into one fictional character. She did it with precision and literary intelligence, and an ethical seriousness about the limits of what she had the right to say about people who had actually existed. Catherine McGregor took that fictional character, already compressed, already constructed from borrowed components, already twice removed from any individual human reality, and expanded her back outward into a fully realized person with an inner life, a personal history, a complete psychology that had never existed in any form, at any time, in any document. Laura erased the particulars to create the character. McGregor invented the particulars to bring the character to life. Between those 2 transformations, between the compression of 3 real women into one literary figure and the invention of a 5th person from scratch, the historical record of who those women actually were became almost entirely inaccessible to the culture that consumed the result. Margaret Owens, who ran a mercantile. Nellie Owens, who lived to 80 in Oregon and left almost no record of what her full life contained. Genevieve Masters, who died too young in Chicago and was buried in South Dakota far from the New York home. She'd never stopped carrying in her posture and her accent and the cut of her clothes. Stella Gilbert, who drove west and built a life in Washington and died 1 year after the book that borrowed her romantic history was published. 4 women, each real, each possessed of a full human story that the historical record preserves only in fragments, each now living in the shadow of a villain who never existed. The first episode of Little House on the Prairie aired on September 11th, 1974. Catherine McGregor's Harriet Oleson walked onto the screen carrying 8 pages of invented biography and 30 years of theatrical training and a complete creative vision for a character that no source material had ever provided for her. She was compelling. She was specific. She was vivid in the way that only truly inhabited characters are vivid, not performed, but lived. She was simultaneously hateful and funny, and, in the occasional unguarded moment, unexpectedly, briefly human. America watched. And America, which has a particular appetite for a villain it can love to hate, began to believe. What happened next? What happened when a television character became so powerful in the public consciousness that it began to move backward through time, began to attach itself to the historical record, began to make people ask the wrong question about which woman had been the real Harriet Oleson, is a story about how popular culture shapes history, about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten and what gets completely rewritten. But to tell it properly, we have to go back to that soundstage. We have to follow Catherine McGregor through those 8 pages. We have to understand what she built, and how she built it, and why it worked the way it worked. Why a woman who invented a character from nothing created something that felt more real to more Americans than 4 actual women who had lived and loved and struggled and died in the actual frontier towns that the show claimed to depict. Because that is the real question at the centre of all of this. Not whether the show was accurate, not whether Laura's books were autobiographical, not whether Harriet Oleson was based on a kind woman or a cruel one. The real question is, what does it mean when fiction is more persuasive than the truth? And Catherine McGregor has the answer. You're not going to see it coming. She is 49 years old when she walks onto the soundstage for the first time. The set is built to look like Walnut Grove, Minnesota, circa 1874. The Mercantile has a false front and real shelves, and the particular quality of artificial prairie light that a film crew manufactures with electricity and coloured gel, and the specific instincts of a cinematographer who has studied the actual prairie long enough to know how the sun falls on wooden storefronts in late August. It is meticulous. It is also, if you know anything about the actual Walnut Grove of 1874, the actual Owens family, the actual Mercantile, the actual human beings who moved through that small town before anyone thought to make television drama from their lives, a complete invention. Catherine McGregor knows it is an invention. She has done her homework, 8 pages of it. Here is what those 8 pages contained. Not the character as the show would present her. Yeah, not the comedy, not the schemes, not the catchphrases that would become the shorthand by which an entire generation of American television viewers would identify a particular type of female antagonist. What those 8 pages contained was a childhood, a history, a psychology. McGregor sat down before she filmed a single frame and wrote the story of a woman who had been an only child. That was the first decision, and it was the most important one. She decided deliberately that Harriet Oleson had grown up without siblings, no brothers or sisters to compete with, no one else to draw her parents' attention, no experience of having to share what was hers or negotiate for her place in a household that would have given it to her unconditionally regardless. An only child in a prosperous family, and accustomed from birth to occupying the centre of the available world and deeply, genuinely bewildered by any situation in which she was not. She wrote about Harriet's parents, what kind of people they were, whether they had been warm or cold, attentive or dismissive, the sort of parents whose approval was a constant and therefore meaningless, or the sort whose approval you spent your entire life chasing and never quite catching. She wrote about Harriet's education, whether she had been sent to a proper school, whether anyone had told her she was intelligent, whether intelligence had been the thing she was praised for, or beauty or social grace, or simply the fact of being the only child in a wealthy household who therefore required no justification for existing. She wrote about what Harriet believed about herself, the parts that were true, and the parts that were the story she told to keep herself intact. 8 pages, for a character who had not existed in the source material, for a woman whose name did not appear in a single chapter of the books the show claimed to adapt. McGregor described her own creative philosophy in a later interview. I look for the humour of Mrs. Oleson. She was originally painted as just black and white mean. Anyone that mean has to be a fool, so I began mixing farce into it. That is the whole architecture of the performance contained in 2 sentences. A villain who is a fool is not frightening. She is funny. And a villain who is funny is something far more durable than a villain who is simply frightening, because audiences can return to her week after week without exhausting their capacity for dread. They can love to hate her. They can look forward to her scheming with the particular pleasure of watching someone who is always going to lose but who will, in the losing, create a spectacle worth watching. McGregor had trained for this kind of work her entire professional life. She had graduated from Northwestern University with a Bachelor of Science in Drama in 1947, the same year that the Little House books, 12 years after their first publication, were still selling steadily to a country that had not yet discovered television would reshape what stories meant to them. She had studied under N. Richard Nash and under Sanford Meisner and under Stella Adler, 3 of the most significant acting teachers in American theatrical history. 3 people whose approaches to craft occupied different positions on the spectrum of how you locate the truth of a character from the inside out. She had worked in theatre throughout the 1950s and 1960s, appearing on Broadway and off-Broadway. She had taught dance at Arthur Murray Dance Studios in her early years, which is the kind of detail that sounds incidental until you watch her move. The particular physical authority with which she occupied a scene, the way her body made announcements before her dialogue did, the specific theatrical confidence of someone who has spent years teaching other people how to use space and movement to communicate something that words alone cannot carry. By 1970, she'd moved to Los Angeles. By 1974, she was 49 years old, and, by her own account, on the verge of leaving the profession entirely. She had been working for nearly 3 decades in theatre and in small television roles. A longshoreman's mother in On the Waterfront in 1954, guest appearances in The Nurses, East Side/West Side, Mannix Emergency, Ironside, All in the Family, the kind of substantial career that is invisible to everyone who is not paying close attention to character actors, which is to say, invisible to almost everyone. She was nearly done, and then she got the call for Little House on the Prairie. The series premiered on September 11th, 1974. Michael Landon, who was producing and starring as Charles Ingalls, and who understood, with the instincts of a man who had spent 15 years on Bonanza watching how recurring antagonists drove weekly drama, had recognised immediately what McGregor was doing with the character. He gave her room. Creative freedom of the kind that is genuinely rare on a network drama, where the pressures of episodic production and advertiser relations and network standards typically produce a compression of creative possibility rather than an expansion of it. Landon trusted McGregor's instincts, and McGregor's instincts were building something he had not specifically asked for, but recognised the moment he saw it. Over 9 seasons, across 152 episodes, Catherine McGregor inhabited a woman who did not exist. The performance that resulted was technically extraordinary, not in the showy, awards season sense of extraordinary, but in the structural sense. McGregor was doing what Meisner had taught her, what Adler had taught her. She was not performing from the outside in, imitating the external signs of selfishness and vanity, but from the inside out, locating in those 8 pages of backstory the specific emotional logic that made each of Harriet's schemes feel inevitable rather than imposed. She knew why Harriet did everything she did. She knew it the way you know things about yourself that you would never articulate to another person. In the body, in the automatic assumptions you make about how room should treat you. That is what the audience felt without being able to name it. They felt the specificity. They felt the reality of a person who had been fully imagined by someone who cared about her enough to give her a childhood. They called it hate. What they actually felt was recognition. The Harriet Oleson who appeared across those 9 seasons was not a static creation. McGregor evolved her. In the early seasons, Harriet operated primarily as a social antagonist. Gossip, manipulation, the specific small cruelties of a woman who used community opinion as a weapon and wielded it with remarkable efficiency against anyone who threatened her sense of her own position in Walnut Grove's hierarchy. She was the character audiences loved to condemn over dinner, the woman whose schemes they predicted from the opening scene and watched unravel with the satisfaction of seeing someone who deserved their comeuppance receive it. In the middle seasons, cracks appeared, not redemption arcs, not the softening of a character into sympathy that can defang a great antagonist, but complexity. Moments where the engine driving all that scheming was briefly visible, the insecurity, the need to be noticed, the particular loneliness of a woman who had organised her entire personality around the performance of superiority and was running a deficit of genuine connection she could not quite account for. In one notable episode in the 5th season, Blind Journey, Part 2, Harriet Oleson, the woman who had spent 4 years demonstrating that she was the most reliably ungenerous person in Walnut Grove, confronted her own racism and emerged from the confrontation changed. Briefly, imperfectly, in the way that real change is brief and imperfect. She became, for a moment, a person capable of recognising someone else's humanity across a divide she had previously refused to acknowledge. An audience does not carry that moment with them for 50 years unless the performance has been real enough to make the surprise feel earned. Alison Arngrim, who played Nellie Oleson and who spent 9 seasons watching McGregor work, would later write, "I have had people ask me, just what was that woman on?" She was not actually Mrs. Oleson incarnate, but my God, she was close. That observation, that she was close, is the key to what happened next. Because a performance that feels close enough to reality to make a trained actress who shared a set with it for 9 years say, "My God, she was close," is a performance that will be mistaken for reality by audiences who never had the corrective distance of watching it be made, who watched it in living rooms, in the years before streaming and pause buttons and second screens, in the particular immersive way of 1970s network television, where the weekly commitment to a story made characters feel like neighbours. The audience believed in Harriet Oleson, and when you believe in someone, you assume they came from somewhere. Here is where fiction becomes history. The first generation of viewers, the people who watched Little House on the Prairie in the 1970s and early 1980s, who raised children on its reruns in the late 1980s and 1990s, who passed it to grandchildren in the 2000s, had for the most part never read the original books. They knew the show. The show was their text. And the show, with 9 seasons of carefully developed character and backstory and episodic consequence, was a far more complete narrative than anything Laura Ingalls Wilder had put into print. They searched for the real Harriet Oleson. They found, in the search, Margaret Owens, the mercantile owner's wife, the woman whose married name had been borrowed and altered by Laura, in one of the 2 instances across the entire series where she changed a real name to protect people she had portrayed negatively. And from that discovery a story began to form, not a story constructed from evidence. A story constructed from the particular human need to make fiction cohere with reality, to close the gap between what was shown and what was true. The story went like this. Harriet Oleson was based on a real woman. The real woman was actually the opposite of the TV character. She was kind, she was generous, she extended credit to struggling families during hard times. She was the good neighbour that the show had inverted for dramatic purposes. It is a beautiful story. It carries the satisfying emotional shape of a redemption narrative, the rehabilitation of someone unfairly maligned, the recovery of the truth beneath the myth. It is not supported by a single piece of primary evidence. What the historical record actually shows about Margaret Owens is this. She was born around 1836. Her husband William ran the mercantile and served as Walnut Grove's first treasurer in 1879. They had 2 children, Nellie and Willie. She died in 1908. There is no surviving letter, diary, newspaper account, court record, church record, or personal testimony that documents her personality in any direction. Neither kind nor cruel, neither generous nor petty. The historical record about who Margaret Owens actually was, as a human being with an inner life and a set of values and a way of moving through the world, is a silence so complete that it cannot be filled. We know she existed. We know her children's names. We do not know what she was like. And the claim that she was the opposite of TV Harriet is not history reclaimed. It is a story invented to satisfy a longing the actual history cannot meet. Catherine McGregor, the woman who created the performance that generated that longing, was by every account of people who worked with her, one of the warmest, most generous, and most professionally committed people on the Little House set. She struggled with alcoholism during the production years, a fact she did not conceal in later interviews, and which she connected directly to the pressures of inhabiting a character whose emotional logic was, as she understood it from the inside, the logic of profound emptiness. She converted to Hinduism, and the conversion helped her. It gave her, she said, the spiritual anchor that the performing life had not. In 1983, when the final episode of Little House on the Prairie was filmed, Catherine McGregor was not there. She was on a pilgrimage to India. The series ended without its most recognisable antagonist. Not because of conflict or illness or professional falling out, but because she had found something more important than a finale to attend to. After the series, she retired from acting. She lived at motion picture television fund residences in Woodland Hills, California. She wrote and directed and produced plays for a children's theatre company associated with the Vedanta Society. Small-scale work, unrecognised by the industry that had made her famous. Exactly the kind of quiet continuation of a craft practised for its own sake rather than its audience. She died on November the 13th, 2018. She was 93 years old. The tributes that followed emphasised universally the gap between the woman and the character she'd played. Warm, generous, the opposite in every substantive human dimension of the person she had been famous for embodying. The irony was not lost on anyone who understood the full arc of what had happened. The real Catherine MacGregor was described in her death notices in terms that bore an uncanny resemblance to the invented description of a real Margaret Owens who had never been documented at all. 2 women, one real, one imagined, both described as the opposite of the villain. Only one of those descriptions was true, and the true one was about the actress, not the frontier wife. 3 layers. That is what stands between you and the actual human beings whose lives occupy the foundation of this story. The first layer, 4 real women, Margaret Owens, Nellie Owens, Genevieve Masters, Stella Gilbert, living in 3 different frontier towns across 2 different decades, connected to each other only by the memories of one girl who watched all of them and filed everything away. The second layer, Laura Ingalls Wilder, sitting at a desk in Missouri in 1930, compressing 4 real people and 30 years of memory into a single composite character, changing the family name to signal that she knew she was being unkind, building an antagonist from borrowed components because the story she was telling required one, and the truth was too complicated to fit the architecture she was constructing. The third layer, Catherine MacGregor, 49 years old on a soundstage in 1974, writing 8 pages about a woman who had never lived to bring to life a character who had never been in the books, to portray a family whose actual name had been changed because the author had wanted to protect them from exactly this kind of association. 3 transformations, each one moving further from the specific, irreducible reality of the people involved, each one adding a layer of invention that felt, to its audience, more real than the layer before it. And underneath all 3 layers, barely visible now, 4 women who lived and died on the American frontier and deserved to be known for what they actually were, not what a story needed them to be. The question is whether it is too late to find them. The answer is more complicated than it appears, and you may not be prepared for what the historical record says next. Here is the complication you were not prepared for. It is not that the real women were good. It is not that they were secretly kind, secretly misunderstood, secretly the opposites of the villain that was built from their borrowed names and borrowed mannerisms and borrowed geography. That would be the comfortable answer, the redemption narrative that satisfies the particular American appetite for stories where the wronged are rehabilitated and the record is corrected and everyone gets the truth they deserved. The real complication is more interesting than that. The real complication is that the historical record, when you actually dig into it, when you follow Robin Elizabeth Miller through the census filings and the court documents and the obituaries and the genealogical archives that are the only places these women still exist in any form, reveals that the real women were not villains, but they were not saints either. They were something far more durable than either of those categories. They were human beings. Miller's 2016 book, The 3 Faces of Nellie, is the only book-length investigation ever conducted into the real women behind Laura Ingalls Wilder's composite antagonist. Miller spent years in the archives, following Nellie Owens to Oregon, Genevieve Masters through New York and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota Territory, and Stella Gilbert westward from Connecticut-descended Minnesota stock across the Dakotas and out to Washington state. What she found, documented across hundreds of pages of primary research, was not the story of 3 mean girls who got what they deserved. It was the story of 3 women who lived full, complicated, genuinely dramatic lives that the fictional version of them could not begin to contain. There was the Nellie-like drama, because of course there was. Miller's research surfaces embezzlement, census lies, shady land deals of the kind that frontier expansion generated in abundance, where the gap between what a claim said and what a claim contained was wide enough to build a fraud inside. The real women, it turns out, were not above the specific moral compromises of their era and their circumstances. They were as capable of sharp dealing and strategic misrepresentation as any frontier family operating in a legal environment that rewarded speed and punished scrupulousness. If you were expecting clean rehabilitation, if you came to this chapter hoping the historical record would show that these women were nothing like the character built from their components, The archives have not cooperated. The real women were, in certain documented respects, capable of behaviour that the fictional Nellie Oleson herself might have recognised. But Miller also found the beautiful things. She found the enduring love of a husband who stayed faithful after terrible loss. She found the rare closeness of a mother and daughter who chose to share their lives as adults. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine preference, or a friendship that grew out of a relationship that could have been defined entirely by duty and became something far warmer instead. She found the strength of a young widowed mother, a woman who had been the romantic rival on a buggy seat in Dakota Territory, who had been the beautiful girl who frightened Almanzo's horses, who outlived her first husband, raised her son alone, and then headed west in true pioneer fashion, not fleeing, choosing, moving towards something rather than away from something, with the particular courage of a woman who has already survived the worst and discovered she is capable of surviving it. That woman settled in Washington state. She lived in her community for 50 years. Even she buried 2 husbands and raised a son, and watched siblings scatter from Minnesota to California, and died at 80 with a grandchild and a niece, and neighbours who knew her name. She was buried with the rites of the Christian Science Church she had practiced her whole adult life, which tells you something about how she had decided to meet the difficulties that came for everyone who lived long enough. She died in 1944, 1 year after These Happy Golden Years was published, the book that borrowed her buggy ride, her flirtation, her fear of horses, and her face. Whether she knew any of this is not documented anywhere. Whether she recognised herself in the Nellie Oleson who appeared in Smet in the book that came out the year before she died, whether she opened that book in her living room in Yakima and felt anything at all about what was in it, is a silence the historical record has not broken and likely never will. That silence is the common condition of all 4 of them. Margaret Owens, the woman whose married name was borrowed and altered into the name that 50 years of American television would attach to its most memorable villain, is the most silent of all. She was born around 1836. She married a man named William Owens. They ran a mercantile in Walnut Grove, Minnesota during the years when the Ingalls family lived there. William served as the town's first treasurer in 1879. They had 2 children. Margaret died in 1908. That is the complete historical record of Margaret Owens as a human being with an inner life. No letters, no diary, no newspaper account describing her character, no court record establishing any dispute, no church document noting any particular role in the congregation, no neighbour's memoir that remembers her name. The silence around Margaret Owens is so total that it is itself a kind of document, not of who she was, but of how thoroughly the ordinary lives of ordinary women on the American frontier failed to generate the kind of paper trail that historians require to reconstruct a person. She existed. She ran a store. She raised 2 children. She died. Everything else that has been said about her, the claims that she was kind and generous, that she extended credit to struggling families, that she was the warm and benevolent opposite of the TV character who borrowed her name, is not history. It is the story people needed to tell about her, shaped by a desire to redeem someone who was wronged by the machinery of popular culture. The desire is understandable. The story is not verifiable. What the historical record actually says about Margaret Owens is silence, and silence is not redemption. Silence is just the absence of evidence, which is an honest thing to sit with even when it is not the satisfying thing. What about William Owens' own political role and the family's standing? He was elected Walnut Grove's first treasurer in 1879 as documented, verified civic fact. He was a man of standing in a community of 165 people, where standing was visible and contested. The Owens family was not a family of background shadows. They were a family of civic presence. And yet their daughter Nellie, the real one, not the fictional one, outlived Laura Ingalls Wilder herself. She died in 1949 in Estacada, Oregon, 2 years after the woman who had described her, 50 years earlier in an unpublished manuscript, as rude and selfish. She was 80 years old. She lived a full adult life in Oregon that left almost no record beyond the vital statistics of its beginning and end. She never, as far as any existing document shows, commented publicly on the books that had made a version of her name famous. She never contacted Laura Ingalls Wilder. She carried whatever she knew about the books, about the TV show that would follow 17 years after her death, about the particular fate of being someone a more famous person once remembered badly, in the same silence that seems to characterize everyone connected to this story. Silence. Always silence. The women who were real were quiet. The woman who was invented was loud. And that asymmetry between the theatrical volume of the fiction and the archival near invisibility of the reality is the whole story in a sentence. This is what popular culture does when it's powerful enough. It does not simply entertain, it displaces. It moves into the space where historical memory lives, and it furnishes that space so completely, with characters so vivid, personalities so specific, conflicts so satisfying in their dramatic resolution, that the original occupants become almost impossible to locate. You look for the real people, and you find only the reflection of the fiction, which has been there so long it has started to look like a mirror. The Harriet Oleson that 152 episodes of Little House on the Prairie built into the collective American imagination is more present in the culture than Margaret Owens has ever been. She is more present than Nellie Owens, more present than Genevieve Masters, more present than Stella Gilbert, more present in the specific sense of being available for recall by millions of people who could describe her in detail than 4 actual women who lived and died on the actual frontier that the show claimed to depict. That is not Catherine McGregor's fault. She was doing what brilliant artists do. She was creating something so fully realised and so specifically inhabited that it took on a life independent of its origins. She was so good at her work that the work became realer than the history. And that is not Laura Ingalls Wilder's fault either. She was making choices a skilled author makes, compressing, selecting, changing what needed to be changed, protecting what needed to be protected, building a narrative architecture strong enough to hold 60 years of accumulated memory. She was doing literature, and literature does not apologise for being more vivid than the census record. But the consequence of both acts of creation, of Laura's compression and McGregor's expansion, was that 4 real women faded to near invisibility behind a character who never drew breath. And the stories those women lived, the complicated, dramatic, beautiful, occasionally dishonourable, fully human stories that Miller spent years excavating from the archives, went unread by the millions of people who thought they already knew everything there was to know about Harriet Oleson. The most important thing you can take from this story is not the facts, not the specific dates, the find a grave memorial numbers, the land claim records, the census filings. Those are the evidence. But the lesson is larger than the evidence. The lesson is this. When you believe you already know someone, you stop looking. And when you stop looking, you lose them entirely. Not to death, not to the passage of time, but to the story that moved in and replaced them before anyone noticed the original was gone. So here, finally, is what the record actually says. Not about the fictional women, about the real ones. It says that Nellie Owens lived to be 80 and moved to Oregon and died in 1949 with a name that had been borrowed and altered and made into something she may have recognised but probably never said a word about publicly. It says that Genevieve Masters died at 41 in Chicago, 5 days before her 42nd birthday, from pneumonia, and was buried far from the New York she had never quite stopped carrying in the way she walked into rooms. It says that Stella Gilbert raised a son alone after being widowed young, moved west in true pioneer fashion, and built 50 years of community life in Yakima, Washington, and dying in 1944 with the quiet dignity of someone who had outlasted most of the defining events of her own history. It says that Margaret Owens left no letters, no diary, no account of her own inner life, and that the silence around her is so complete that all anyone can honestly say is that she existed. She ran a store, and she deserved better than being the named origin of a character she was nothing provably like. It says that all 4 of them, 4 women who lived real lives on the real American frontier, deserve to be known as themselves, not as the raw material for someone else's story, not as the cautionary tale behind a TV villain, not as the misidentified inspiration for a character that was invented from scratch, as themselves, whatever that turned out to be, however complicated, however flawed, however full of the specific texture of lives that were not simplified for the purposes of narrative or entertainment, or the nostalgia of a Depression-era reading public that needed something to believe in. That is the whole story, or almost the whole story, because there is one document that most people have never read, a document that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote before the children's books, before the composite characters, before the name changes, before the Depression-era myth-making that turned a complicated frontier life into the most beloved pioneer series in American history. She wrote it around 1930. She wrote it in soft pencil on lined school tablets, nearly 74,000 words, longhand, intended for an adult audience and not a child in sight. She wrote it with real names, with real places, is with the kind of unvarnished honesty that publishing houses in 1930 were not prepared to sell to a Depression-era public that wanted consolation, not confession. She wrote about poverty that was not romantic, about drunkenness and lechery and an aunt's divorce and neighbours whose love lives were more complicated than anyone in a children's book series could acknowledge. She wrote about the people she remembered, with the frank, unsparing clarity of a 63-year-old woman who had lived through enough to know that softening the truth was a choice, not a necessity. And then she gave it to her daughter, and publishers rejected it, and it sat unpublished for 84 years. In 2014, the South Dakota Historical Society Press released it for the first time. Scholars who had spent their careers working on the Little House books finally had access to the unedited original, to what Laura actually wrote before Rose shaped it, before publishers required it, before a country in crisis needed the version that would comfort rather than confront. What they found in those pages changed everything scholars thought they understood about the gap between Laura's memory and the story she chose to tell. It is the document this entire series has been pointing toward. The real Laura Ingalls Wilder, the one who described Nellie Owens by name, who described Genevieve Masters by name, who described Stella Gilbert by name, who described her own life with a candour that would have been unrecognisable to the millions of children who knew only the book version, is in those pages. The manuscript that publishers said was too dark to publish. The autobiography that sat in an archive for 84 years while the mythology it contradicted grew into one of the most powerful cultural presences in American history. The document that shows you the real woman behind the sunbonnet, with her guard completely down, writing the truth because she had not yet decided which version of the truth the world was allowed to have. Pioneer Girl is the story behind every story you have ever heard about Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it is the story we are telling next.